Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&A. I'm starting to finally tweak my background setup. I got the guitars hanging in the background, which I really love because music's always been such a giant part of me. But I have another idea for a background that I might try to work on for next week, so I'll definitely be looking for all of your opinions on what do you think is best. But right now, I'm happy with this. I think my New York one was cooler, but at least I have some cool guitars and an amp sitting in the background, especially the amp, because I haven't powered that on in 5 years. I gotta do a live stream once, just setting up the amp, going through it, seeing if it still works. I think that would be a lot of fun. I'm sure many people would think it was boring as heck, but hey, if you're not a guitar nerd, then skip that one. But anyway, enough about my stupid background. Let's jump in and see what we got to talk about this week. First up, over on the YouTube subscribe service, Scotter140 said anytime they look at ads for CRTs or pick one up, they try to Google the model number to research it and often get little useful results. They were thinking it would be great if there were a database for CRTs where people could upload photos, specs, links, general info, schematics, cap kits, RGB mod guides, etc. Is that something that's planned for the wiki, or is there already a website out there that does this? That is absolutely something I was hoping people would take over on the wiki. There's some info scattered around the internet, and it's just one of those things like the beginning of retrorgb. I could probably start compiling all of this stuff, but then I'd get to the same place I'm at now, where it's one person, trying to get many people's worth of work all in one place. And I really think letting people do it themselves in the wiki is the right move, because I always try to make sure that people know that none of the stuff that I do is about me, except like room tours and stuff. But I mean, like the bigger picture stuff is always about the community, the hardware, everything else. So I want to make sure all this stuff lives on past me. So trying to put myself in charge of anything is a huge limiting factor to that. So yes, I really hope there's an entire thing about any CRT anybody finds that's just as basic as here's the model number, here's a couple of pictures from my cell phone, and here's the inputs that it has, and that's it. Even just the very basics, I think, would be a very cool thing to start compiling. I just spoke to the developers that are working on the wiki, and it's supposedly like almost ready to go into beta. And by beta, I mean anybody could view it, but we're still going to have to iron out how to do the contributions and all that stuff at first. And, this is obviously going to be a learning process because there's not many wikis of this scale that I've ever been a part of. Obviously, Wikipedia is bigger than this will ever be, but still, it's something that we all have to kind of learn as we go. And there's going to be different things that people go about. It's not as easy as saying, here's the criteria, because there's going to be a million ideas like this that people are going to say, hey, could we store this info? And the answer is almost always going to be yes, but just finding the best way to do that will be something that we have to learn how to do. So, great question, and I'm very excited to someday fire up, wiki.retrorgb.com and then just go through a list of CRTs and figure out what has which inputs or cap kits or any of the other things that you mentioned. So, great idea, and sorry for the years-long delay, but I just want to get this out right with the right people behind it. I don't want this to fall on its face because I didn't have enough time to keep it up. Next, over on Floatplane, the importer said, so far the concept of the Mr. SNAC adapters for the usage of light guns has worked perfectly, since all of the consoles that have a core so far could only use one at a time. One zapper, one light phaser, one menacer, one super scope, etc. That being said, what will happen with the upcoming PS1 and Saturn cores? The cool part about light gun games on these systems was the two-player feature. Will we be limited to one light gun, or do you think a SNAC splitter could be made? So I definitely don't want to talk out of turn here, because I've never designed a SNAC adapter, and I've never written software that speaks directly to an FPGA's pins, but I think it's possible to do a two-player adapter in that scenario. A lot of factors would have to be involved, such as like which pins on the controller activate the light gun. Is it minimum pins per port? Is there a way to do some kind of faking with that in the software? The only scenario in which I think it would be impossible is if for some reason both PlayStation and Saturn output all the signal on all the pins on all the controllers at all the same time, and I don't know that that's the case. It could be, but I don't think so. The only other factor would be that with the PlayStation 1, you would have to find a way to get sync out of it. So if you're using an RGBS cable going into an RGB monitor, that's super easy. You just take the output of the RGB monitor and plug your PlayStation light gun into that. But there's definitely going to have to be some things figured out for that, which I'm sure the team behind it will do. But I've seen a bunch of people working on SNAC adapters. I have some here that are pretty awesome, but getting them out today in a part shortage, in a shipping crisis and all that stuff, I don't know if there's going to be delays that we're not going to be able to deal with. But as far as proof of concept goes, I think we would be okay. And just for anybody that's listening, yes, the Lethal Enforcers games support 2 players, but those all go through one controller port. So the pink gun plugs into the blue gun, which plugs into one port on the console, which is why that's not a big issue. And just to appease all of the actually people out there, the one NES game, Chiller, allowed for 2 zappers. I've only tried it once, and it didn't really work that well. But I don't really know why or what the deal with that was. But other than that, I think, your question's fair, and my fingers are crossed because there are some pretty cool light gun games on both consoles. But once again, on a CRT and on a flat panel, you should be able to take a Wiimote into one of those plastic gun adapters with a Bluetooth adapter and be able to use it that way. And it'll be, I don't want to use the word laggy because it's not laggy, but it won't be quite as accurate as the original experience, but the shot itself will probably be more accurate, even with or without the aim control on, because there's, these things are 30 plus years old, and I've seen plenty of light guns sometimes work and sometimes not for no reason. I could never figure out why. So there is always the other option of doing it that way. But as far as actual 2-player SNAC support for light guns, cross your fingers, but I think they could pull that off. Over on Patreon, Darkstar7 wanted to chime in regarding some of the conversation about the Ikagami and JVC monitors and had some thoughts. They've also had a bunch that had sync issues, which seems to be pretty common. I think it's in the same vein as the BVM A-series monitors, in that you'll need a special kind of sync regeneration, or possibly even a different input card scenario, but I guess that would also be just sync regeneration as well. So that's something to expect if you're going to use those. Also, apparently they're even more fragile than some of the BVMs, and the bezels could break fairly easily. And also, some of the models apparently squish everything above 480p into 16:9 no matter what the resolution is. And I think that the Sonys do that too. I could be wrong. I think you could force it to 4:3, but I definitely had an issue with that in playing 4:3 content that was native 720p or something like that, because it was a square resolution, but it detected it as 720p, a wide resolution. So that's really something that you have to mess with per monitor and per output source. But it's basically, Darkstar 7's post goes through a bunch of list of things that are compliments and nitpicks on the JVC and Ikagamis. And I just want to reiterate that any CRT is a win if you're retro gaming, and any professional monitor is a bigger win if you're into sharpness and video signals that could support multiple things, RGB, better colors, all that stuff. So if you're in the market for one of these and you have the ability to pick one up, I strongly recommend not saying, well, I'm going to wait for a BVM or I'm going to wait for an Ikagami 17-inch or something. I would just pick up, if it's for a fair price, pick up whatever you can and kind of go from there. The reason I'm so picky about this stuff is because I'm looking to do archival footage and, preservation. There goes the buzzword these days. But in all honesty, I really want to chronicle the different tubes, the different monitors, how they work, why they're different. And, I'm definitely going to be working with people that I know that have a whole bunch of monitors, Phil, Steve, a whole bunch of people. And I want all of the basics myself here so I could have reference footage. So it's not, a lot of people see that CRT wall picture and love to tease, which, by the way, I love that too. I never mind being the butt of the joke. But in all seriousness, that's not a hoarder's CRT collection. More than half are consumer grade TVs. Well, maybe not half, but About half are consumer grade. Another chunk are in the midst of repairs, so they're not like a bunch of good, all of them are perfect monitors. Some of them need parts, some of them aren't even mine, they're just here for testing and footage, and then I'll move them along. So I'm not trying to stockpile and hoard CRTs, I just want to make sure I have, I want two 20-inch VGA monitors, one Sony and one non-Sony, and then I also want one 20-inch non-Sony PVM. Multi-format would be awesome, but if it's just 15 kilohertz, cool. And I'm certainly willing to trade and swap stuff around and stuff like that, because I want to get footage that matches. And somebody the other day even offered to sell me two 20-inch features, the exact thing that I needed. And then somebody else bullied them into selling it to them. It was the weirdest thing. I'm like, I have the cash. I would have driven down. Just give me an hour. But that was disappointing, because that would have like completed the circle on a whole bunch of testing I have to do. But anyway, I'll stop bitching about my CRT luck. I just wanted to echo Darkstar 7's statements and kind of just give a basic thoughts on CRTs and professional monitors. Jonathan Levine would like a drama-free summary of the 3.3 volt and 5 volt flash cart issue, as well as a way to figure out how a cartridge, or what voltage a cartridge is running at. And this is my third time trying this, and I always slip into drama, so I'm going to try really hard to be just factual about this. As for how to know what voltage a repro cart or a flash cart is working on, you would have to really take a look, analyze the chips that are being used, trace it out, and see if there's level shifters, see what the chips themselves run at. You'd have to look up their data sheets and then see. So there's no really easy way to just say, oh, look at it and look for part number 1, 2, 3. You have to check the chip, what voltage it runs at, and what's going on in the power and ground rails to the chip to see what voltage it's at. Now, the whole issue with this is more of a concept than it is actual fear of your console, with some exceptions. There was at least 1 or 2 NES and Neo Geo carts years ago that were very dangerous, like to the point where Renee put that in his article. If you see those, especially the NES one, don't ever put that in your console. But mostly it was just a sign of shoddy craftsmanship or people learning as they go. And the problem is, if you have somebody who's learning as they go, and you have a cartridge that will not really hurt your console, probably won't. I can't imagine a scenario in which it would. The cartridge itself is going to last a lot less time than it would have if it was running at the right voltage. Probably, we're guessing all that. But that's different. That's one thing. That's an indie developer learning as they go. They're making changes as they go. And I don't think anybody has a problem with that. But the problem is when people double down and say, no, you're wrong, this isn't an issue. The Earth's definitely round, whether you would like it to be or not. And the other side of that are the companies that really just cut corners any way they possibly can because they want to get that $150 special edition out. And they know that they could take advantage of a lot of people who want to collect stuff that makes them feel like they're young again, but they're adults with some disposable income. And they know that they're probably not going to use this cart over and over like they would as a kid. So they slap a bunch of misspelled garbage together in a crappy piece of cardboard and sell it as a limited edition or a special edition or something. And that's kind of an issue. That's where the drama came in, and that's why we were all arguing, hey, if you made this mistake, what other mistakes are made? And it stinks. And the other thing now is any company that does it now, there is a lot less of an excuse because all of this info is out there and all of this info is being very vocally discussed with facts behind it. This isn't an opinion. This isn't, I love heavy metal, but somebody else likes classical. This is pretty factual based. So that's why when you hear people discuss it today, it's kind of like, hey, what are you thinking? You didn't Google it? You didn't just Google how to make a flash cart and see all the stuff that comes up? Like, I just spent $100 in the special edition to have a square bezel and running at the wrong voltage. I thought this was a quality product. So that's the other side. And I'm pretty sure that's a level-headed response without any drama. I could certainly get into the forum trolls and other, the other stuff that we did. The only thing I will mention is Renee and I did a video after all of this happened, after the drama hit, after people were starting trouble, and at the time, retrorgb was still a site that had quite a few hits, page views, whatever you want to call it. But I had 0 social media followers and like under 1,000 on YouTube. So we made a satire video joking around about it. And if you knew what we were talking about, you might not find it funny, but you knew what we were talking about. And then as Renee and I's following grew, a lot of people took that as if we were like attacking cricks, which we never did. Never. But so I took that video down, and that is my fault. I shouldn't have gotten involved in the drama at all. It was just really ridiculous. Like Renee was waking up, Renee and I both, but more Renee was waking up to just message after message of like, you're lying. That card I bought from AliExpress is perfect. How dare you talk badly about, just the craziest stuff. So we were like, let's just have some fun with this. And, maybe I shouldn't have, but I certainly laughed my butt off. So hopefully that's a good overview of everything. I'm sorry that there isn't a very easy answer, but it's more of one of those things like you get your cartridge, and ask the places that you're buying it from, because that's another thing that, once again, no drama here, but if you ask a company, hey, I'd love to buy this thing that you're releasing next week, but I just want to check, are the edges going to be beveled on the cartridge? Is the voltage correct? And are you using hard gold finish or something else for the connectors on the end, for the pads? Anybody that's taken the time to design it right will love to answer that. They might even have a copy and pasted thing ready. Like, yes, we're really into this for the quality and we want to make sure you have a good product. Anybody that gets annoyed with you or doesn't answer, that's a huge red flag. If it's ignorance, fine, but like, that's definitely something that I would encourage people to do, because if the answer is yes, we did all those things, whoever's answering those emails is going to tell the developers, maybe it's even the devs themselves, and they're going to be like, all right, people are taking notice of my good work. And heck, a lot of them are even putting that right in the description, so you don't even need to message them. You could just search their Kickstarter or their page or whatever, and they'll say beveled edges, hard gold finish, running at the correct voltage and all that. So that's very cool. I'm glad that people are paying attention, but that's something that we should definitely all be echoing our statements of. Like, hey, if I'm spending a lot of money on a collector's edition or a special edition or something, let's just make it right. It doesn't have to be made out of gold and comes in, perfect packaging, like whatever. Just make sure the game works and is built correctly. Matt Richtenberg said they paid somebody to install a VGA virtual tap on their donor Virtual Boy. The bottom row of pixels is missing in the image. They've seen videos of Virtual Tap on YouTube that are also missing the bottom row of pixels. Any idea? They've messaged Furtech and have yet to hear back. First of all, respectfully, Furtech made it pretty clear that they were going to release this as open source because they didn't have time or want to be dealing with individual support. So I'm not saying anything wrong against you. I'm certainly not trying to shame you for messaging Furtech. I'm just saying I wouldn't expect a response because that was kind of part of his deal. Like, hey, I worked my butt off on this. I sold a few to make some cash back, but now it's open source because I need to move on to other stuff and I don't have time to work on this. So a much better place to ask for stuff like that would be like the Planet Virtual Boy Discord, or basically any of the hardware modding spots out there that people kind of congregate in. And as far as missing the bottom row of pixels, I did a live stream a couple of years ago on that. If you just search YouTube for retrorgb Virtual Boy, it's got to be one of the top 4 or 5 on there. And I don't know if I saw that. So I guess I would try to find that live stream I did. I'll put a link in the description. And if you see the issue there, then it's got to be an inherent thing with the Virtual Boy, and it's probably not something that would affect gameplay. Certainly not like a missing piece of data from the screen. If you don't see it there, so mine looked fine, and yours and maybe somebody else's doesn't. It could be a bunch of things. It could be the revision. It could be the way it was installed. It could be the cable. It could be a lot of different things, firmware, whatever else. So I would use that as a reference and go from there. And if it does turn out to be something that happens on every one of them, it could just be a necessity. It could be how the image is processed. But that's something that, would really need to be a longer discussion. And maybe then Furtech would want to get involved if it turns out to be a global thing where you might have to reflash with a newer firmware. But either way, if it's just the bottom row of pixels, a single row of pixels, there could be nothing there. It could be information stored for something else. So I think I would need to know what you mean, because I'm so used to analyzing consoles and arcade boards that a missing bottom row of pixels is often a good thing, because there was just junk down there anyway. So I would definitely ask that you double check, and then we'll kind of go from there. And once again, I hope my first statement on this wasn't taken as an insult. I didn't mean it that way at all. I was just providing an explanation as to why Furtech might not get involved in something like this, because that was just always part of the deal. Pilus had a bunch of questions that are all regarding to building up a new retro console setup. And in respect of everybody's time, I'm just going to kind of skim through each of the questions. I don't mean any disrespect by this. I just want to make sure I get your questions answered, but don't take 3 hours just to do it. So first, they have a confusion about RGB. Since component and SCART are the same quality, does that mean you don't need an RGB mod in your console if you're using component cables? So in the case of something like a Wii, where you could just plug in component cables and get 480p and 480i, you're right, you would not need to RGB mod it. You could find a PAL version, you could get a different kind of mod on the inside, but you wouldn't need to, and I wouldn't recommend doing it unless you had a very specific setup. But something like a Super Nintendo Mini or Junior, you need a mod to get RGB out of that. Same with N64s. So whether you want RGB or component doesn't matter, because you still need to get the mod to get the higher quality signal. Whereas like an original Super Nintendo or Super Famicom, any of the Mega Drive or Genesis, you just plug in a cable for that. So hopefully that put things in perspective. Number 2, does the M Classic cable, is it worth the money if they want to use them in general in your whole setup? No, that's a hard no. Now, on the flip side, after you get your setup done, or as you're building your setup, there are specific uses for the M cable that I think it's awesome and well worth the money. The problem that I have with it is their very shady marketing that makes it seem like it's the perfect device for all retro consoles. And of course, the people out there that spent the $100 on one, so now they feel the need to defend it to the death because they spent their money on it. So I would say get the M cable or M Classic or whatever, get that last or near last, because you could find that the way your setup is wired, the consoles that you're using, your signal chain, everything's perfect the way it is. Or you could get towards the end and say, I'm playing a lot of original Xbox, a lot of PlayStation 3, and I could benefit from that. Or in the situation of like, if you have some of the classic emulation consoles like the Genesis, TurboGrafx Mini, all of those, the HDMI, you could set that to retro mode and integer scale it or something like that. There are some uses for the M cable that are excellent, but it's not a general purpose device like they make you seem it is, or like they try to make it seem like it is. It's definitely not. Next, all of their consoles are NTSC, but they moved from Venezuela to Finland, so power is 220. Can I recommend a good voltage power converter? No, I would go the opposite. You could get a power converter, but I think it's a much better idea, especially when you're talking about older consoles that you don't know what condition the power supplies are in, to get a bunch of international power supplies. And Firebrand X has a link to all of the Triad power supplies with their international models that could work with pretty much every console out there. So I think it's a very worthy investment to pick up a couple of these and use those instead of changing the power. So essentially you're taking the 220 volt in and having this high quality power supply change that to the 9 volts or whatever that's needed on the other side. So definitely go to firebrandx.com and check out the links to new retro power supply replacements. Next, am I planning to add in the wiki page that I'm looking for a a space to include links for different kind of retro products like controllers, memory cards, etc. Yes, I just want to be careful about that because I want the wiki to be just the facts. So here's a list of products available type of thing, whereas I want retrorgb to be the opinions. So wiki.retrorgb.com, facts. Retrorgb.com, opinions. And that's the place where I want to put my thoughts on, like with N64, if you go to the page now, the getting started videos there, I added, or I'm about to add the getting started section. And that's the type of thing where I'd like to say, here's my favorite memory packs. Here's my favorite controllers. And if you know that you have similar likes that I do, cool. And in the same way, if you know that I like different stuff than you, don't buy those. Whereas the wiki is really just going to be, here's a list of all the controllers available today if people decide to add that. So good question, but I think for something like controller recommendations especially, you want to find a reviewer that likes the same style games that you do and see what they like. And of course, check all the usual. What's their reputation? Are they a reviewer that will talk about any product they get for free, or are they actually objective and give their real thoughts on things, all that stuff. Basically, if they're promoted on retrorgb, you could trust them. And people make mistakes. People have bad things happen in their life and they do weird shit sometimes. But generally speaking, if we promote them, it's because they have a proven history of doing cool stuff. Or they're a newcomer that it's worth taking a chance on because they have a cool something. Also, as a non-native English speaker, a lot of times they get confused with abbreviations for words like FPGA. It would be awesome to have a page in the wiki with an explanation of all of these retro gaming abbreviations. That is an excellent idea. I've never thought about that, but you're so right, because so many times in the weekly roundup, I'll say something like the FPGA pins on the HDMI connector with the USB port, and it's like, did I get that right, or did I just say a whole bunch of letters from the alphabet out loud and hope that it fell in place? So that's an excellent idea. I hope that somebody would take the time to add that, just like a dictionary reference type of thing, glossary of terms, whatever you want to call it. But that's a really great idea. Thank you for suggesting that. And thank you very much for the kind words. I really appreciate the support. Welcome to being a new supporter. And I hope I'm able to get you started on building your retro setup. Any more questions, just ask next week. But I think your questions are good because they're questions that a lot of people probably will have. So hopefully this could help other people as well. Quantum Guitar wanted to get some clarification on the Funtastic model N64s that supposedly have sharper S-video and composite video than some other models do. And I honestly don't have much experience with this. It was always my opinion that if chasing the sharpest signal possible was your thing, that you should try to hunt down one that you could do an easy RGB mod to, or spend the time and a lot of effort of doing the more advanced RGB mod to. And I also think that S-video and composite from the N64 look totally fine, especially in context, right? Composite on a CRT looks excellent on the N64. Composite through a scaler on a flat panel looks fine, but S-video also looks good too. It really just depends on your total setup. And once you start scaling from 240p early 3D graphics to a 4K TV, it's really hard to make it look good at all. I think I kind of detailed that in the N64 video I just posted. So it's a very lame excuse, I know, but it's the honest truth as to why I never really researched that. Everything that I researched originally just came from some forum posts from trusted members of the community. Not somebody that said, I found an N64 that seemed sharper than somebody else's. There was real data and stuff, but it's just not something that I always kind of worried about. And it was the same thing with the PAL editions of the N64, and that, pick one up, and if it doesn't support S-video, that stinks, but composite's still fine, or you could also do an RGB mod to it. Because that's something else. I'm very happy that people are chronicling how to restore S-video on those, but unless you're doing it for fun, or you have a very specific reason, like you have an S-video switch or something like that, if you're going to open up a console and take the time to do a mod with surface mount components, you might want to put the effort into an RGB or an HDMI mod, not just to step up to S-video. all of those things are my opinion, though. And if your opinion is different, that is totally cool. I just kind of wanted to explain my thoughts and also why I don't have a section on the website. Now, hopefully someday if the wiki ever launches, we will get all this info up and anybody in the community could post their experience with screenshots and stuff like that. I mean, it's got to be professional. There isn't going to be a quick cell phone picture taken, with no context. Somebody that wants to do a real analysis of it, which there's a lot of people out there. There's a ton of people that don't mind contributing, but they don't really want to spend the time doing that in a forum because of the forums that we've already lost and all the info that we've lost. And they don't want to spend the time and effort of creating their own website. So there's a lot of info scattered around in different places that I think people would be very happy to put in a central location that's designed to last forever. We'll see. I mean, I'm certainly going to do everything I can to make sure that wiki gets into a place where it's hosted and, where hopefully even a not-for-profit at some point. So it really is just all about the community. But either way, we'll see. But sorry, I don't really have anything to offer other than a link to, to the stuff that's already been talked about. Rick Lewis said, "They're not asking me to vouch for something I've never used. However, from the viewpoint strictly of the safety of the electronics involved, would you have any worries about using a cheap powered HDMI to composite converter from Amazon?" No. Now, of course, anything could happen. They could make 1 million of those and you could get the one that has trouble. But generally speaking, if it's self-powered, so not powered by HDMI, I wouldn't have any worries about safety whatsoever. And if something bad happens, it really would be like the 1 in a million scenario. And I'm not even worried too much about stuff that is powered by HDMI. It's not really supposed to be powered by HDMI. That's supposed to be there for something else. So it's always safer to just have that plug so you don't even have to worry about it. But no safety concerns. Give it a shot. It's going to be super laggy and it's going to convert it to 480i, not 240p. But I could think of a handful of reasons that you might want to mess with that just for fun, just for the heck of it. Also, completely unrelated, is retrorgb my full-time job or just a really consuming labor of love? No, that I could never do this on the side. I always try to word this just honestly with no emotion, but I always feel like I'm saying this sounding like a whiny asshole. But the truth is, everything about retrorgb.com and the behind the scenes stuff especially is like a 50-hour work week. And then the higher production YouTube videos are like 20 to 40 hours just by themselves. So that's why I haven't been doing them since the move, because that extra time that I would have spent on that has been going onto the house. And to be honest, I don't want to go back to doing that. I don't want to go back to working 80-hour weeks. That was absolutely killing me. It's just, it's the weird chicken and the egg thing, right? Where those higher production videos bring in new subscribers, and without those, I'm able to maintain, which is cool, but without a subscriber growth, all of these things change over the years. So like affiliate codes from eBay used to pay so much more than they do now. So I have to make sure that, 20 times the amount of people click on a link to get the same payment that I would have, 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So you have to grow subscribers to maintain income. And once again, I know, like, even as I'm saying it out loud, I sound whiny and unappreciative. It's not at all how I mean it. I'm just very emotionless and factually explaining the behind the scenes thing. So it's a weird thing. Like, I have to grow the subscriber base just to maintain, but growing the subscriber base means working a second almost full-time job, with retrorgb being the full-time job. And I haven't really figured out a way around it. And there's been a bunch of excellent tips and suggestions from people that just don't apply to what I do. One of the things that I love the idea of is farming out editing to another place. So I just do like a 3 or 4 hour live stream testing something, and then have somebody else edit the live stream and cut it into a 10-minute video. The idea of that is amazing. There's just no possible way I could pull that off, because I would have to train somebody else on what to look for, the side-by-side comparisons, stuff like that. So yeah, it's a full-time job and a half, I guess, is the shorter way to answer that question. And your last question, is your significant other into video games? If so, modern or retro? Not really. She'll play Mario Kart with me now and then, but because this has been such an all-consuming thing for the past 3 years since I started doing it full time, that I don't actually get a chance to play video games that often. So when I do, it's usually things like whatever I'm doing on a live stream, which is, just me, or syncing into a game like the Ori games, Axiom Verge, Metroid Dread, like just turning off all the lights, turning up the stereo, and just kind of sinking into a game, and kind of like, it's almost like meditation where I'm just not thinking about anything else and just being part of the game. So a lot of my gaming experiences are like that. They're more personal than they are, like any of the arcade stuff is obviously all about hanging out and having fun with people, but at home it's very often just me doing my thing. So good questions, and hopefully I didn't come across as unappreciative with the retro RGB explanation. I never mean it that way. I love doing this. I feel very grateful that I get to do this full time, but it's always worth explaining because of so many people that just assume that because I have a YouTube account and a Patreon that I'm like rolling in the dough and get to work 10 hours a week and play video games for a living, and it's never been the case. Not even remotely close. Couple of questions from Choir Boy. First, what's up with Atari 7800 RGB mods? I believe that the Sophia mod is still available, which is a DVI mod, and I think that there's an RGB version of that as well. So I would check out like Atari Aegis, Atari 7800 section. I believe there's a few more people working on getting RGB from the 7800, but that's the one that's currently available. And I'm not sure if the other ones are going to be HDMI or RGB, but it's slow moving, but there's definitely progress, and there should still be DVI mods available if you're interested in that. Also, Choir Boy wanted to know any kind of newer high-def NES mod or some kind of HDMI mod coming for the front-loader NES. And I haven't really talked to Kevin in a while. I should probably just say hi anyway, but I don't know of anything coming out or any new versions of the high-def NES or any other batches of production, but I really hope that other people might step up and consider that. And I think another important thing would be all of these HDMI mods, I really hope they get some kind of direct mode. And I do realize that there's limitations with HDMI chips, so maybe it's going to be like a 1920 by 220 or whatever, but resolution output. But by direct mode, I just mean that some way of outputting the original-ish signal so that even if these projects are abandoned and no new features get added and the rest of the gaming community figures out how to do CRT filters and better scaling, that these HDMI mods don't become obsolete. Because once the scalers are released, like the OSSC Pro and the Morph and a few others that there are talks about, but no real info yet, as soon as those are released, they should be able to handle stuff like that. So stuff like the high-def NES, if you're looking for 5x scaling and a CRT filter, you're not going to get any of that. And I don't know that Kevin would ever really introduce that. But if there was a direct mode, you could then plug it into any of these new scalers, which I'm sure will get, 5x mode they would all be able to do, and I'm sure they're both going to get cooler CRT-style filters and stuff like that. So that's my hope. I don't know if it's going to happen. I've talked to a few people that make the HDMI mods, and they're all like, oh, it's a good idea, we'll see, but, hopefully. But at the moment, it's not a necessity because there isn't a scaler that does that. But hopefully by the time there is, then the people who make these mods would consider that firmware update as well. So I guess it's kind of a short version. There's the Sophia stuff for the 7800 now. There's more stuff coming, and I don't know of anything HDMI related for the front loader, but I really hope there's something. One more question from Quantum Guitar. They just got a RetroTink 5X Pro, but they're confused about aspect ratio options. Are the generic 16:9 modes the only way to capture and utilize anamorphic widescreen properly when scaling to 1080p? So that would really depend on your use case. And for me personally, if it's something like you set your Dreamcast playing Rayman to 16:9, so you set that right in the menu, I would probably try setting it to the regular 4:3 DTV 858 mode, and then using my TV to stretch, and then switching the RetroTink over to 16:9 and putting my TV back to normal and see what looks better. Do you get a shimmering effect? Is there some kind of scaling issues? Does one just look better to your eyes? Do they look the same? But if you're going into a capture card and you don't have the ability to resize, or you're not exactly sure what you should do about the size, I would just set it to 16:9 and let the RetroTink handle it. I don't know if there's a definitive answer. I don't know if it's like you should always do it this way because, but I've just tested both, and I very often use the 16:9 mode on the 5X when, I shouldn't say very often because I don't run into that too much, but whenever I have been in the scenario of that exactly what I just talked about, I've just stretched the RetroTink to 16:9 and let it do it for me just to make everything else easier. But I've never really done a deep dive. So, and it might not be the same for every console or every game or something. So I would kind of just try that yourself. Also, do the optimized timing modes always just implement square pixels? Not always. I think you have to combine that with your scaling. I could be wrong on this one, but like 1080p fill doesn't keep square pixels, but 1080 over and under do. So I think it's a combination of the scaling and what you set it to. And square pixels is something that it's always a debate, right? If you have a 256 wide pixel wide image and you do 1080p 5x and you leave it at square pixels, it's really close to 4:3. People will argue that, no, it's not because this and that. At the end of the day, it's square-ish. It's not as narrow as emulators. Maybe not is as wide as an original CRT, but it doesn't ruin the experience for me at all. Whereas on the flip side, 320 wide pixels in 5X mode, that is a little too wide, but it does have some other advantages, and sometimes it bothers me, sometimes it doesn't. So I don't know. I would really just kind of do whatever looks best on your TV to your eyes. And if you're using a CRT filter, using the generic modes might even be a better idea anyway, and you wouldn't notice the difference with the CRT filter on there. So that's kind of one of those, just mess around and see what you got. Alex S. said one thing they'd love to see from the channel would be a video about N64 controllers in light of the new Switch controller, specifically regarding the joystick, which is notorious for wearing out due to its design. From teardowns they've watched of the new controller, the design looks very similar to the original. Hopefully they used different materials that don't erode like the original. They'd also like to see if anyone is working on solutions to make the new controller compatible with original hardware or emulators. So there's a few things to respond about that. The N64 is not my favorite console, and I am nowhere near an expert in the controllers, nor would I know exactly what to look for. And there are some obvious ones. If you fire up GoldenEye and you have a heck of a time aiming, then your analog stick isn't working right. But there's also some not so obvious ones like drift and how far can you move the analog stick before it stops responding, and there's stuff that people who love the N64, who are experts in it, have covered, and that's why I didn't want to fake it through that N64 video I did, because I would so much rather look at the camera and go, I don't know, than try to see, well, I'm the man and I know what I'm talking about, so let me recommend something that's going to waste your money. And like, I could never do that. I just don't have it in me. So, and even now, with your very nicely asked question, I can't fake it through anything like that. I got to just be honest and say, for something like that, you should definitely try to find channels that are reputable, that give good reviews, that love whatever console that you're talking about, and like the same games as you, and kind of go from there. Also, about the analog stick, I do think that it might be neat where you might be able to take this out and swap it in with the original. But there's also a lot of people spending a lot of time and a lot of money trying to get the best analog stick replacements. And there were some delays with one project. There was a couple projects that released quietly, but I think there's a few out there now that are very good, to the point where your average gamer wouldn't notice the difference, and they may or may not be good enough for experts as well. So I would look into those before cannibalizing a new controller. However, your question of is anyone working on solutions to make the new controller compatible with original hardware or emulators, I just posted today that the Blue Retro project has added support, and there isn't a device you could buy yet, but I hope people would be working on them. And I think that people are also working on getting it working with emulators and stuff like that. And that is a use that I think would be awesome. Using this off-the-shelf, but somehow still original N64 controller on things like emulation and the Mister and original N64s. I love that. So that is an excellent use for it. And I really hope that all of that stuff comes through. But I'll definitely post more info when it's available. And if I ever, I would just search, like My Life in Gaming did a great video about the controllers. And there's a few fans of the N64 that really did it justice. And I would much rather recommend their awesome videos on it. Although I can't remember exactly which one's off the top of my head, but I don't mean that to be insulting. I'm just kind of tired. So sorry, I'll have to leave the Googling up to you this time. Andrew C. just bought a RetroTink 5X specifically to try out the new scanline filters, but their consoles are HDMI outputting. So they have a high-def NES and an UltraHDMI and a Super NT. So they're looking for ways to get that into the RetroTink to utilize the scanlines. And what I would definitely start out by doing is picking up one of those cheap $20 converters that you mentioned. So retrorgb.link /cheapdac. You don't have to get those, but those are ones I've personally tested that have zero lag going through them. So I would just set all those consoles to 480p, connect it to one of those cheap DACs, and go from there. And then if you wanted to kind of see how it compares, I would do something like grab Composite or S-Video out of the N64 and plug that directly into the RetroTink and kind of see how different it looks from feeding it the 480p signal, if at all. And then same thing with the original NES. Try plugging in Composite versus 480p from the high-def NES and kind of see how the scan lines look. And if they're close enough, set it to generic mode each time and all that, but they could be close enough. That could be all you ever need. And for a $20 box, then, you're totally set. It could look different. I haven't done those comparisons yet, so it might not be what you're looking for, but I'm confident in saying just spend the $20 because while I don't ever want to have anybody waste any money, that converter is more like a tool in your toolbox than anything else. So even if you don't use it for this, the fact that you have those consoles with those HDMI mods, there's going to be some other reason to use it in the future. So I always look at these more like, if you go through and you buy a tool to use, you're only going to use that a few times in your life, but you don't call that a waste of money because now that's something else that you're able to use in the future. So that's definitely the mindset I have when I buy those converters. I buy, especially with the cheap ones. I wouldn't have said that about like a $300 converter, but a $20 one, definitely. So I would start from there and go and see what you think. But I have a feeling that you're going to really like it. A few questions from Jason Guffey. First, they have an 8x4 Extron crosspoint, and they're wondering if they could upgrade that to have more inputs and outputs because the holes are there, they're just covered up, or if they should just buy another one. And I vaguely remember taking one of those apart with the same question in mind, in that could I just solder some BNC connections in there? But it looked like a lot more circuitry involved. So while it could be easy, you could just have to order a bunch of parts and solder everything on yourself, I would definitely be more comfortable giving the advice of just picking up another one and then maybe trying to mess with the original. But this way, if something goes wrong, you don't just take your main switch out of your chain. Next, do I know of any software or emulators that can use frame interpolation to get a 60 frame per second video out of 30 frame per second games? No, but that's how old consoles worked. So Sonic the Hedgehog, the original, runs at 30 frames per second, but all Genesis consoles output 60 frames a second, and they're just outputting 2 frames. Or doubling up the frames when they output, I think that's how it works. But I'm definitely sure about the 60 versus the 30, because this is something that's been talked about and tested. So it won't really give any kind of effect, I think. I could be wrong about that. Maybe I'm just getting tired and I'm misremembering, but I'm pretty sure I'm right, and I don't think it would do anything notable. I think maybe running it in 120 frames per second could certainly add some different effects to CRTs. It could lower latency on monitors that accept that, on flat panels, of course. But I don't know if it would do anything like what you were mentioning, like the soap opera effect. But that's probably something an emulation expert might want to answer. Are there any plugins or something for any emulation software that could do this for any reason? It's a good question, but I'm not really sure it's going to have any extra effects. Lastly, they've noticed that some GameCube and Wii games have an option for a flicker filter. I've never used those because I always thought those were something that was only necessary with 480i, and I always use GameCube and Wii in progressive mode. So almost always 480p, but 240p when I'm playing games like Game Boy Interface software or some of the WiiWare titles or Virtual Console titles. I don't really play those anymore, but I certainly did when the Wii was my main gaming console, when I first started retrorgb, back when it was still a Google Doc. So I don't know. I'm certainly not the person to ask that because I almost never use 480i because I only use it when there's no other option. And when I do, I use it on a CRT, so I don't really care if there's a 480i flicker because it doesn't look the same as on a flat panel. If Bob deinterlacing on a flat panel, I can't play for hours. It might give me a little bit of a headache, whereas on a CRT, I don't even know. I would notice a bit of difference, but it's not massive like it is on flat panels. So if anybody out there has any info, or could at least point to a link to how these flicker filters work and what do they do and do people like them, that's certainly not something I've spent time on just because I've used the other options. But that is a good question, and it's something that I'm curious to read about. Heinrich said that they're moving their gaming setup to a different room and they're using it as an opportunity to rethink their cabling setup. They previously had an open source scan converter running through a DVDO box that both normalized the output and acted like an auto-switching 8-port switch. And now that they've switched over to the RetroTink 5X, they don't need the DVDO, they just need an HDMI switch. So this is one that I never like to answer because I've never found a switch that I love. I've found cheap, crappy little 5x1 HDMI switches that mostly worked fine. I'd occasionally have to power cycle them when moving between retro, or especially when swapping resolutions on the OSSC. That would always freak it out. But for the most part, they were fine. They did require some attention, though. That's something that you have to pay attention to, in that, all right, it was just working. Why is my setup not working? Restart the HDMI switch. It's not a set it and forget it thing. But the other thing that I've always looked for, that I've never found one that I liked, is I want an HDMI switch with 2 outputs that also extracts audio, and I've never found one that worked well. I have 3 sitting in the box, that one of which I never got working, and I sent it back to the company and they sent me a brand new one and it still didn't work right. I plugged it in a few months later, it worked great. Turned it on 3 days later, didn't work anymore. So I think there's just so many things involved in that I think the best recommendation would be to jump on Dirk Splizzer's thread, just read through it and see what people are using today, because there are people in the exact same setup as you that have found stuff that works for them. Just note, there's a global part shortage. Companies are scrambling to get stuff out, so what somebody bought a month ago might not be the same today, even though it's the same link, the same case, the same logo, the same model number. So just keep that in mind. So make sure to buy from a place that you could return if it doesn't work. But I'll drop a link to that thread, and hopefully that's a help. Richard Webster has a question about the GBS Control's output options. And for anybody unfamiliar, GBS Control is a firmware hack for the GBS 8200 and 8220 boards that were scalers. I wouldn't really recommend them. But with Rama's amazing software, all you have to do is mod in a Wi-Fi module, flash some software, and then connect to it with your phone or your PC, and that is an awesome scaler. And relatively cheap, all things considered. It's just something that you probably need to buy yourself or find somebody to build one for you. And once you have GBS-C loaded, set the output to 480p, then go into the advanced options and select which deinterlacing mode you want. Motion adaptive is almost certainly the one that you would want to go with, and that's it. You have nothing else to worry about. If the input signal is 480p, it'll just pass it through. If the input signal is 480i, it'll deinterlace using motion adaptive deinterlacing, and that will be 480p. And if your input signal is 240p, it'll just line double it. So that would be the perfect solution for using a VGA monitor. And in fact, I think overall the GBS-C might be one of the best devices, if not the best device out for that, because it only outputs analog video, which is what you would want for a VGA monitor. So I think that's an excellent device for people that want to take all classic consoles and just use a VGA CRT monitor instead. So, definitely great solution. I think you're going to enjoy it, and basically just set it to 480p and set your property interlacing and you're done. Well, that's it for this week. If you're new to these Q&As, please ask your question wherever it is that you support in the latest Q&A post, because the way these services work, I can't really figure out what's a new question on an old post, and I think it's a lot of fun to just scroll through and ask like I do here. So any question at all, fire away, and if for whatever reason I miss it, it's always an accident, so please either re-ask or just DM me or something like that. And also, I really hope that I might get to see some of you at Retro World Expo this weekend. But either way, thanks to everybody who does this. And of course, thank you to everybody who supports in any way possible, because it's you who's keeping all of this stuff alive. So thank you all very much, and I'll see you next week. Or maybe this weekend.